Have you ever had a deal where the prospect is saying every single thing you want to hear and you're like, yes, I've got this deal in the bag, it's 100% going to close, only for that prospect to ghost you at the finish line? If you answered no to that question, there's a high chance you actually haven't worked enough deals. So today's video, I want to walk through a very easy and quick way that you can actually leverage Claude to help de-risk a lot of your deals and improve your win rates. And everything I show in today's video, you can actually download for free as well. Now, before we dive into the video, quick intro to me. My name is Sanjay Ravichandran. I've been in tech go-to-market for 8 years now. My expertise is really around how to get companies that have never heard of your product or service to buy from you for the first time, and then for your existing customers to not only renew, but also expand their usage of your software. 2 years ago, I also started learning programming to help build AI applications and AI agents, not only to drive revenue for my business, but also to drive revenue for my clients. And so in this channel, you can really get videos around the tech sales and tech marketing fundamentals, as well as how to build AI revenue systems. Now, without further ado, let's dive into today's video. Now, before we start talking about Claude and AI, I think it's actually very helpful to understand how sales teams actually identify which deals are the most qualified, what are the risks in the deals so they can help mitigate them, and then how do they actually know when a deal is supposed to close and what's the probability that it will close. So I've sat in a couple hundred of these forecast calls and deal reviews. Every sales team that I've ever worked for, at least on a weekly cadence, has some sort of deal review or forecast call. And typically at the start of the forecast call, we look at our overall pipeline and kind of dissect it using two primary parameters. The first one is sales stage. So the way to think about a sales stage is a customer is in a certain part of their buying journey. And if you look at all of these different sales stages, there's an exit criteria here. This is the next step that the customer needs to take in order for them to move in the next part of our sales process and our sales funnel. So as a sales rep and a sales team, our primary focus is to complete these exit criteria so that we can reasonably say that this deal is moving from scope to technical validation or from technical validation to business case review. So that's the first thing we discuss. The second thing is, if you see here, is called forecast categories. So this is the probability that the deal is going to close based on the information and the stage that the deal is in. And so if you look here, like pipeline is at the very start of the sales process, there's a 0% chance. So when our CEO or a sales leader rolls up our forecast, they're not including these deals that are in discovery as a deal that will close in the particular quarter. So as a deal progresses through the process, ideally the probability increases, but the goal of having these forecast categories is to say that with a 50% chance, this deal will close in the next 3 months. That is the goal of these forecast categories, and we spend a lot of time here to understand what are the risks to close the deal within the time frame that we're forecasting it. So a lot of these forecast calls, and that's why we have these categories, is to give a probability and say that do we have a chance that this will close with a 50% certainty? And if not, what are the risks that we need to get ahead of? Now, sales stages and forecast category are the macro view. So this is to look at your overall business and figure out what deals are sitting where and how much overall revenue can you bring in. The most common thing once you've identified a deal that has some risk or that you're forecasting to close is to do what we call MEDDPICCing the deal. So MEDDPICC is probably one of the most common frameworks used in enterprise software to really identify what deals are qualified, what information we have on the deal, and to identify the risks. So if you think about the sales stages and categories as like the macro view, MEDDPICC is at the individual deal level to figure out what information we're missing so we can go back to our prospect and collect that information. So MEDDPICC really breaks down into, it's an acronym, it breaks down into 8 things: metrics, economic buyer, decision criteria, process, paper process, pain, champion, and then competitors. So what the goal of this is during a forecast call or deal review is to figure out, do we have a champion in the deal? If not, that's a huge risk, and how do we mitigate that risk? Do we know the decision process? If we don't know that, there's no reasonable way that we can forecast a deal is going to close by the date that we say it'll close, so we need to go get that information. So part of MEDDPICC is to really give a framework and a scorecard to identify what's the information that we have today on a deal, what's the information that's lacking, and any information that's lacking is risk that we don't know and we need to get and solve for. So this is a very common framework that I've used over my entire career to figure out what deals are qualified and how qualified they are, and what risks am I not aware of that I need to get ahead of. So now that we have a foundational understanding of how do we identify deals that are going to close and by when, let's actually talk about how I'm using Claude to help me through this process. Because the problem with MEDDPICC is, I think, 2 things. One, it actually takes a lot of time. And so a lot of deals that should get MEDDPICCed don't get MEDDPICCed because a sales leader has like 40 or 50 deals that they have to look at, and they can only really spend, their cycles to really focus on maybe a handful of those deals. So a lot of deals that probably should go through this process never actually do because it's just a huge and very time-consuming process. That's one piece. The second one is the fact that I feel like everyone learned MEDDPICC a little bit differently. Even though it's supposed to be a very like almost empirical, kind of scorecard for your deals, everyone likes to bring their own stylistic taste to MEDDPICC and to their sales stages and their forecast categories. So even in like the couple companies that I've worked for as a sales rep, all of them seem to have their own kind of stylistic change or taste to it. So really it comes down to like who you have as a leader, which I think adds a lot of risk because you might have someone who's having a bad day and they might not really care about what the risks are. And so you get a lot of inconsistency as you go through this process. So what I've been using Claude for is to actually take the best practices of MEDDPICC and deal qualification and codify it into a Claude skill so anyone can have a deal coach on standby. And really the big thing is, now you can actually qualify and MEDDPICC more deals. And also in the background, it's not dependent on your sales leader, how they're feeling that day or how they were taught this framework. So the fact that we can have a little more consistency, hopefully, in the call out of the risks and the qualification of our deals, as well as to be able to do that across more deals, was really the goal of building out this Claude skill. So what I'll do now is actually walk through the Claude skill using some example deals. I'm not allowed to use my real world deals because if I do, I'll get fired and lose health insurance. So because of that, I've actually created some sample deals that I actually ran as part of the evaluation process for this skill. And we'll run through this and then talk about what Claude is giving us. And then so hopefully you can start using this workflow for your deals. So let's see this in action. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually import in a markdown file with all the information on a sample deal. In reality, what I actually do is take the transcripts of all the meetings that I've had with a prospect, put them into like a Google Doc, and then upload those Google Docs here. And I'll also upload any sort of slides or proposals that I might have on the deal itself. Now, one other thing that you could do is if you do have access to any of your CRM data or any of your outreach data, you can also connect this here. We have a lot of joint Slack channels with our customers, so we can even upload that or connect Slack to this so that it'll actually pull information from those channels in case there's any conversations in Slack that are relevant for deal strategy. So, but here, since this is a sample, I just have a single document with the deal information. And here what I'm gonna type in is say, can you review this deal and identify the risks and the next steps I need to take to close this deal. Use the deal coach skill. I always usually just invoke the skill. This is just something that I prefer to do, especially if I know I'm going to be using a specific skill anyway. So I always like to invoke it using the / command. So let's run this. Let's let this run for a second, and then let's see what Claude's initial output is. Now, while Claude is running its deal diagnosis, I do want to unpack this skill. I'll leave a link in the description below to where you can actually download this skill and start running it on your own deals. But this skill is packaged with a skill.md, which really goes through, how Claude should act and the workflow it should go through. There's different reference files, one for MEDDPICC, one for the different plays. The plays are the next steps that Claude will recommend to help mitigate risks in your deals. And there's a scoring rubric as it goes through the MEDDPICC process. And then here are all the sample deals that I created to evaluate this skill. One thing to call out is if you do download this, I would highly recommend looking at two things. One, implementing any sort of external sources. So this can be Slack, Salesforce, whatever ways to get more information or context in for Claude to have all the information it needs to evaluate the deal. And then second, if you do have any sort of markdown file on your brand voice or how you want to communicate, that'll be helpful if you do want Claude to start writing, follow-up emails or follow-up messages to execute on these plays. So those are other reference files you can start adding and really making the skill your own. So let's go through Claude's deal diagnosis for this. We said the deal was going to close on May 30th with a 70% chance of closing. Claude's saying it's closer to 5 to 10%. Goes to the MEDDPICC scorecard, says that we basically have nothing on this deal that would tell us that this should close at a 70% confidence level. I think the big things for me is one, the economic buyer doesn't exist, which is a huge risk because if an EB doesn't exist, then like an EB is there to corral internal resources to execute contracts. And if they're not there, then there's no reason this could close. Second thing is there's no MAP, which stands for Mutual Action Plan. So if we don't know what process a customer has to take to issue an order form, or excuse me, sign an order form or issue a PO, then there's no way you can say it can close by May 30th. So those are definitely the risks in my eyes. And Claude actually calls out the economic buyer being one. One thing it doesn't call out is the fact that there is no champion. If there's no champion in a deal, you can almost take the probability to 0%, because if there's no champion, there is no deal, almost like 100% of the time. But it does call out the big risk, which is there's no EB. It's hard to forecast this when you don't have the ability to know what the process looks like for the customer. There is supposed to be some external research, but since it's a sample deal, it didn't go through the internet. And then it gives a plays of what are some tasks or actions that the sales rep can do in order to help mitigate this deal, or mitigate the risks to drive this deal to a closure, or if the deal isn't supposed to close, get it out so the sales rep can focus time on the deals that should close. Now, one thing I do want to call out as it goes through the plays is this is not meant to replace the salesperson or the sales manager. This is to give a salesperson a menu of options to figure out like what are the next steps that they can take. And then for them to use their nuance, their intuition, their interactions with their customer to figure out what would make the most sense to execute on to drive this deal to close. A lot of founders that I've worked with, a lot of salespeople that are starting their careers that I've worked with, like sales are very messy, like deals are very messy. And so sometimes you get kind of lost in the deal process for a particular deal, and you don't really know, how do I get this back on track, and how do I actually, like, what do I do next to get this back on track and drive it forward? So the goal for the skill is to really call out the risks, call out the next steps, and then the salesperson can figure out what risks do they feel are valid, and what are the next steps that they need to take in order to close this deal. So this is a good example. I ran this through a couple other ones as well. Here's another sample deal where, it's half of MEDDPICC was filled out. Decision process is still very much, unknown. That's a huge risk. Here's another one where it talks about the win probability. Here are all the gaps in MEDDPICC, all the different risks and the plays. And then this one is actually an example of a done deal where the probability is very high. All of MEDDPICC is filled out. But still, what do we need to do to make sure that we can get that 80 to 85% to 100% and get that order form signed? So I think this is the real value of the deal coach skill. So that's the video for today. If you found it valuable, like the YouTube video and subscribe to the YouTube channel. I try to post weekly on YouTube. If you guys found these skills valuable and want to use them for your own deals, I'll leave a link in the description below on where you can actually download these skills files and start running them in Claude on your own deals. But outside that, I'll see you guys next week in the next video. See you guys.